Good afternoon. I'm Chris Adelia from the Waco Metropolitan Planning Organization, and I'd like to welcome you to the next of a series of public informational meetings we're having on actions that are being proposed by the MPO Policy Board. And if we go to the next slide here, today we're going to be talking about several more performance management efforts related to establishing future performance targets. Today we'll be talking about safety targets. We'll also be talking about public transportation asset condition targets and travel time reliability targets for our region, and also what TxDOT has done or Waco Transit has done on these items. And once we get through that, we'll give you an opportunity to provide your input and answer any questions that you might have, as well as let you know what the process is for actually establishing these targets from this point forward. We'll go to the next slide here. We want to just remind everyone why the MPO exists and what our role is. We're here to provide local input into long-term regional transportation decisions. We want to give our local elected leaders the opportunity to prioritize regionally significant projects and also have an honest conversation about how to fund those projects. And then under federal law, anything that's using federal highway or public transportation dollars within our region has to be identified through our transportation planning process and identified as a priority in our transportation plan or transportation improvement program. So if we go to the next slide, MPOs are required for all areas that have an urban population greater than 50,000. In our case, we are governed by a 20-member policy board, mostly elected officials, but some of our smaller communities have chosen to be represented by a member of their staff. And that policy board is composed of a 36-member technical committee that is composed of regional state transportation stakeholders, such as Waco Transit, the regional airport, TxDOT, and experts, engineers, planners, and other experts from our member governments. And for the Waco MPO, our region includes all of McLennan County. Next slide. So what we're talking about today is part of a thing called Transportation Performance Management. This is out of the federal FAST Act. And this is the current federal transportation authorization bill. And basically what we're looking at is trying to base our decision making on actual information and data to make better informed decisions about how dollars should be spent within our region. And the focus is on providing an efficient delivery of goods and also to make sure that you can get from point A to point B safely. So if we go to the next slide here, another key part of this is that the priorities that are identified in our plans and programs need to be tied back to some of these performance measures that we're tracking here. And these performance targets that you see here are basically aimed at providing that efficient and safe travel experience for you, the people of McLennan County. Today, we're going to talk about 3 of these performance targets. The other 2, pavement and bridge condition and the public transportation safety plan, those we addressed earlier. We addressed pavement and bridge condition last month, and the agency safety plan was addressed back in December. So if we go to the next slide here, we're going to dive into safety targets first. And the requirement is that we have 5 metrics here to track issues regarding our traffic safety program. So there are 5 performance measures. We're looking at fatalities. We're looking at a fatality rate. So as traffic volumes increase, are fatalities getting worse, or are they holding about the same? We're also looking at serious injuries, which are the same as life-threatening injuries. We also have a serious injury rate that we track. And then we also track the number of non-motorized fatalities and serious injuries. These are bicycle and pedestrian incidents primarily. So let's review where we were last year. Safety targets are one of the things that we have to review every year. And last year, what we were looking at is a target that was adopted by TxDOT that still looks at an increasing rate in fatalities and serious injuries, but that their target was we would have something a little bit less than if we did nothing at all. Basically, what TxDOT adopted was a 2% reduction from that baseline trend that we've seen over the last 5 years. That actually results, when you compound it over year, that actually results in the ultimate decrease of about 4% year over year. And then once we've got to set targets, the idea is to then track where your performance has been and see if you need to make some changes in terms of what you're actually programming in your region in terms of projects. Now, last year, the MPO chose to support TxDOT's targets rather than adopt something that was specific to our particular region. And what that means is that the mix of projects in our plans and programs, we intend to use those to assist TxDOT in meeting their statewide targets. We're not required to have our own targets, but we do have that option if we so choose. Let's go to the next slide here. So for this year, we've got a little bit of a wrinkle. Each set of targets is independent from the previous year targets. And this year, TxDOT chose to adopt a zero fatality target for the year 2050. And what that means for 2021 is their intent is to decrease the number of fatalities this year on a trend line that gets us to zero by the time we get to 2050. On a statewide level, what that translates to is about 684 fewer fatalities less than the year 2020. That's the goal that TxDOT has established for themselves. Now, the interesting part here is that the serious injuries and the non-motorized fatalities and serious injuries did not change from TxDOT. Those targets are still increasing and still increasing at the trend line, but 2% less than that. That has some relevancy for what we're going to talk about next. This slide shows you what the state has actually adopted for their official targets. So on the top line here, if we did nothing at all for the year 2021, we would expect a little over 4,100 fatalities, 18,800 serious injuries, and 2,507 non-motorized fatalities and serious injuries. The 2020 target was a little bit less than that, again, reflecting a trend line increase, but less than if we did nothing at all. So about 4,068 fatalities was the target, 18,602 serious injuries, and 2,477 non-motorized. Okay, this year, since TxDOT has adopted a different target, the fatalities, we're looking at 3,384, a very significant decrease year over year. But you'll notice that the serious injuries is still increasing, over 18,800. And the number of non-motorized also is increasing. And then when we look at that as a 5-year average, taking the target from 2021, adding that to the 4 previous years of actual data, then it's a little bit less here. But you know, we have some concerns here about going with Vision 0 for fatalities, but not for the other metrics. Okay, so we felt that before we go into a discussion about whether to continue supporting TxDOT's targets or doing something ourselves, we need to talk about what the crash performance is in McLennan County. So we've got a chart here that shows you these same 5 metrics for the last 5 years, and then what the average of that 5-year period is as well. And what you see here is that on average, there are about 36 fatalities in McLennan County. Now, when we get to serious injuries and non-motorized, we had to do something a little bit different. And 2016 was a bad year. And if we included that in our trend line analysis, it would kind of suggest that we're actually making an improvement, when in reality, the long-term trend is we're probably level at best. And so we didn't want to give a false impression that things were getting better when they weren't. So we actually did not include the 2016 numbers when constructing the averages and constructing our trend line trend. So if we look at 4 years, we had 188 serious injuries and then 26 non-motorized fatalities and serious injuries. Next slide. All right, so this is where we talk about the difference between the previous targets, which we're using the trend line, a little bit less than the trend line. We're just going to call that trend line here, and the Vision 0 concept. And we went ahead and applied this to the other metrics just to get an idea of what the difference might be. So for 2021, it's not much of a difference. Of course, it's just 1 year into a 30-year target or 30-year goal. So for McLennan County, that translates into 1 fewer fatality between the two different methodologies. For serious injuries, it would be a reduction of 8. For non-motorized, it'd be a reduction of 2. But it doesn't take us very long before these two methodologies separate themselves very significantly. So if we fast forward to 2025, recognizing we're not setting a target for that year just yet, but if we moved out to 2025, that difference is now 13 fatalities, 56 serious injuries, 8 on the non-motorized category. Now we have this question about, can we actually realistically accomplish this, which is the next thing we have to have a conversation on. So let's go to the next slide. So there are 3 questions that MPO staff were asking you in relation to this. So if we have 0 fatalities by 2050 as a goal, should that goal also apply to the serious injuries? Should that apply to the non-motorized metric? And then, okay, what would it actually take to achieve 0 fatalities or serious injuries? So let's go to the next slide here. And these are all showing you the data that we just showed you in a table, but in a graph form, which makes it a little bit more easy to track along. So this is fatalities. The blue bar at the left is our average. 2021, the difference between the trend methodology, which is in red, and the Vision 0, which is in green, not much. We get to 2025, much more significant. This is serious injuries, similar trend. Not much of a difference in 2021, very significant difference in 2025. And then finally, for non-motorized, again, maybe a little bit more of a difference in 2021, but becomes very significant by the time we get to 2025. Okay. So here's where we find ourselves right now. TxDOT has actually adopted a Vision Zero for fatalities, so at a minimum, we have to consider whether that's something that the MPO can continue to support. We also have, because we don't have a Vision Zero for the other metrics, we also have to consider whether we want to support those as well. And we have to take some sort of action pretty soon. Because this is a annual requirement in order to be eligible for federal transportation dollars for the next year. So since we at least have to look at fatalities, we have done the analysis to look at where we've been over the last 9 years. And please pardon me, we do have a visitor with us today. Also known as my cat. So I apologize for that, but she's very interested in this topic. So this first slide here shows trend lines. At the bottom is the total for all crashes, from fender benders to the most serious crashes. And what you see is a general trend line upwards. This is consistent with trend lines that we've seen for traffic volume and population growth for our region. So this is not unexpected. At the top is the trend line for fatal crashes. We were actually doing fairly good at the first part of the last decade with a decreasing trend, but we've basically gone back upwards to where we were about 10 years ago. We don't necessarily have a good explanation for that at this time, but that's something that is concerning to us. So if we go to the next slide, we looked at a couple of factors to try to get some idea of what sort of things, what sort of characteristics are typical of fatal crashes. Well, the first one is speed. It said speed kills. This bears out when we look at the data. So we have considerably more, higher percentage of fatal crashes related to speed as to all crashes. Alcohol and drugs is the other one that really stands out. Alcohol and drugs are only a mere fraction of, or are involved in only a mere fraction of all crashes, but they are a very significant component, almost 1 out of 3 fatal crashes within McLennan County. Distraction or attention is also something that has been an issue of late, especially with cell phones and text messaging. But interestingly, it's more of an issue for total crashes, but it's still not an insignificant issue for fatal crashes, and certainly something that we need to be aware of as well. And then the failure to yield or disregarding a traffic signal or stop sign, these are also significantly overrepresented by fatal crashes, partly because of the angle of collision. There's more force being applied to the passenger cabin in these types of crashes. And so one expects a greater involvement with fatal crashes. When we look at mode and location, bicycle and pedestrian crashes, this was a little shocking to us. Almost 1 out of 4 fatal crashes involved a bicycle or pedestrian in McLennan County. This is significantly greater than the statewide total. But as you can see, bicycle and pedestrian involvement is a mere fraction of all crashes. So this is certainly a area of focus that we think our region needs to be paying attention to. Commercial vehicles also a higher percentage of fatal crashes. But again, this is the laws of physics here. This isn't that commercial vehicle drivers are a problem. It's that trucks are much heavier. They have a lot more momentum. And so when there's a crash involving them, the outcome is usually not as good. Rural highways are far more frequently an issue for fatal crashes. This is speed related. Rural highways generally have a higher speed limit. And And then for the state highway system, same issue. It's usually related to speed, especially when many of the state highways are also in rural areas. And then we also looked at I-35 just because it is a significant percentage of the total crashes in our region. About 1 in 5 crashes in McLean County occur either on the main lanes or frontage roads of I-35. But there's not a significant difference between the percent of all crashes versus the percent of fatal crashes. And this is partly due to the fact that most everyone is probably driving in the same direction on these roadways and at similar speeds. So finally, let's look at time of day and day of week. Fatal crashes are much more frequent over the weekend and much more frequent in the overnight hours. Again, probably related to alcohol involvement, which is also much more prevalent in the overnight hours and in during the weekend. So this is what our recommendation is, that since there's not a huge change for this first year, we have recommended to the policy board that we go ahead and support TxDOT's targets for all metrics for 2021. And then in the meantime, what we would do is establish a work group composed of agencies and individuals who have a level of expertise or who represent folks who have a stakeholder interest in this discussion to identify what kind of strategies make sense for our region and what sort of thing, and whether a Vision Zero target is really even realistic. And then to prioritize what sort of things the MPO can help with in terms of improving these particular statistics. And then that work group would be tasked to report to the Technical Committee and Policy Board at the end of this year and provide a set of recommendations for the Policy Board to consider next February. All right, so that's a lot on safety, and of course there's a lot more to go through on that over the next year. And if this is something that is of interest to you, we apologize for that, but we ask that you stay involved and keep tuning back into our website for additional information. The next item is public transportation asset conditions. So these are the buses, these are the transit facilities, and of course we want them to be in good condition. And there are 3 performance measures that we're tracking here, and that is the percent of revenue vehicles that exceed the useful life benchmark. These are basically the buses. These are basically the vehicles that are actually carrying passengers. And are we using old vehicles or not? And we're using a standard that the Federal Transit Administration has established for what they consider to be an old vehicle. Equipment is officially non-revenue maintenance vehicles. So this is what's used to help operate the system, but they don't actually carry passengers. But we also track those to see if they're old or not. And then for facilities, it's a little bit different. We're looking at a term scale, which the FTA uses to identify whether the facility is considered adequate in terms of its condition, and then also looking at individual elements of those facilities to determine whether they're in adequate condition as well. All right, let's go on to the next slide, which here, what we're then looking at trying to do is, once we have an idea of what the condition of the system is, what sort of investments do we need to start making to improve that condition? All right, so next slide. So in 2020, as in previous years, the Waco MPO has chosen to support the targets that were adopted by Waco Transit. And then related to the project programming on our side, we agreed to select a mix of projects that will assist Waco Transit in improving the condition of their assets. So next slide. There's a lot going on this slide. What we want to focus your attention to is the two columns that are in the middle. And these are the actual percentages of a particular fleet and whether they're old or not. So the one that most people are interested in is at the very top. These are the buses. These are the ones that are on the fixed route system and that you're most likely to ride if you use the transit system. Last year, the percent of those buses being old was 13%. This year we're at 40%. So we've got a number of buses that have now reached that age where they're considered old. And so one of the things that we probably want to have a conversation about is how do we get introduce more newer buses into the fleet. And we have an interest there because old buses do not break down as frequently, and if they don't break down well, breakdowns are a problem because they often don't break down in a good location or a safe location. And so we want to make sure that the transit experience is a reliable experience. But we also see a number of other vehicle types here, which are primarily used for the transit's demand response system. And these are for those who maybe cannot use the fixed route system because of some type of disability, or for a number of other services that Waco Transit provides, such as Medicaid or Medicaid-related transportation. What you'll see here is that a lot of these vehicles are also past their useful life benchmark, although their vans are 100% newer vehicles. And then the other thing to point out here is that Waco Transit has discontinued using minivans as part of their fleet. Then when we get down to the facilities, Waco Transit officially only has 2 facilities as defined by the Federal Transit Administration. And those facilities both score very well on the term scale. 4.4 out of 5 is pretty good. And then 12% of their elements were rated as less than adequate. This also is not all that bad. But of course, what we'd like to do is see that number decrease. And what is an element? An element could be anything from like the air conditioning system, or maybe some equipment used to provide maintenance to a transit vehicle. So our recommendation on here is that the MPO adopt the targets that have been established by Waco Transit. There are no other transit agencies operating within McLennan County, so we feel that our partners at Waco Transit are the experts at understanding the condition of their system and what their needs are, and so we recommend following their recommendations. All right. So finally today, we're going to talk about travel time reliability targets. There's a lot to this one, so we'll try to get through this in the easiest fashion as we can. But travel time reliability is basically trying to measure that variability and how long it takes to get somewhere on a particular roadway. And one of the things that we're trying to get after here is this issue where folks aren't so concerned about the fact that this year their average travel to work took 2 minutes longer. What they're more concerned about is that yesterday it took 20 minutes for them to get to work, and today it took them 45 minutes. And so we'd like to reduce that variability to the extent that we can. All right, let's go to the next slide. So for this target, we're looking at just the part of the system, our highway system, that's defined as the national highway system. That includes the interstate system, but that also includes roadways defined as principal arterials and freeways. It's a small part of our system. It's only 11% of our regional lane miles, but it's 60% of the travel. So these are the most important roadways in our region. This is also a 4-year target. So we actually looked at this in 2018 and adopted a target for the year 2022. But we are allowed to make a mid-course correction if things are trending in a different direction than we were anticipating. And so we are here to go through that exercise because that is what we're anticipating, is that things are a little bit different than what we were expecting 2 years ago. And so this map shows the national highway system. The roadway in blue is Interstate 35. That is the only interstate class facility we have in our region. And then the roadways identified in red are the national highway system facilities as currently defined. Okay, excuse me for just a second. All right, I'm back. So one of the things that we want to, so we've got 3 things that we're looking at here, although 2 of them are related. The first 2 things are the percent of reliable travel for all traffic on this national highway system. But here we've separated out the interstate system from the rest of the NHS system. And what we're looking at is the 80th percentile travel time. Okay, what does that mean? What we're interested in is the percent of time that travel is worse than the worst day in a typical month. And then for truck travel, here we're only looking at the interstate system. And here it's a little bit different. We're looking at a ratio of the 95th percentile travel time for the interstate system and comparing it to average travel time. And so what this is looking at is what's the worst travel over a typical week, which is a much higher standard than what we're looking at for all traffic. Okay. We have a data set that is prescribed to us under the federal program that comes to us from the University of Maryland, and we're very fortunate that we have folks at the Texas A&M Transportation Institute to help us crunch the numbers and give us some recommendations on what makes sense for our region in terms of travel time reliability. Unfortunately, this data set changed in 2017, and so since it was the first time anyone was using this, we actually had some what we called curious estimates when we looked at this. So for instance, I-35 was identified as being 100% reliable in 2017, including the section in Temple that was under construction at the time. So since we didn't have any other sources that we were able to use for this, we kind of acknowledged that that probably wasn't the case, so we actually adopted something less than 100%. Now we get to today, we have some more data to work with, and that data now makes a little bit more sense to us. And so I-35 reliability, for instance, last year, or well, actually in 2019, which is not last year anymore, was down to 88%. And if we consider that most of the interstate reconstruction is complete and is probably operating at about 97 to maybe 99% reliability, we then look at the part that is under construction, which is in downtown Waco. That probably puts us at a 65 to 70% reliability range. This intuitively makes sense, which gives us some confidence that now we're getting some reliable numbers to work with for travel time reliability. What it also means is that we need to reconsider what we did in 2018 because we now have better information to work with. So this chart here shows what we did in 2018. So for the interstate system, we actually adopted a 95% standard. What's proposed now by TTI is an 80% reliability percentage. And we'll explain why so low on the next slide here. But when we look at all traffic for the rest of the national highway system, we adopted an 85% target a few years ago. TTI actually recommended that we stick with 85%, but you'll see here that we're recommending a lower figure. Again, we're going to explain that in the next slide. And then for trucks, remember, this isn't a percentage here that we're looking at. This is a ratio of bad to average. 2 years ago, we adopted a ratio of 1.4. The recommendation is we look at a ratio of 1.75. In this case, higher is less reliable. Okay, so what are we considering here? Well, first, it's better to err on the side of something slightly worse for your target than what you were expecting. There's not consequences for failing to meet a target for an MPO, but there is for TxDOT. And TxDOT's targets are partly related or partly influenced by the targets we establish here in our region. And so if we establish a target that we can't accomplish, then there's a possibility TxDOT might not be able to achieve their target, and they could lose some flexibility in how they use their federal funds, which that's a bad thing. We want them to be able to apply their dollars where the greatest need is. So for I-35, we're going to have construction in downtown Waco in the year 2022. It's still going to be very significant and probably still going to impact travel time reliability fairly significantly. And so that's the reason why we're looking at a lower standard for 2022. Now, we want to note that when we go through this exercise again in 4 years, the year 2026, that number should be vastly improved because all the reconstruction efforts for the interstate should be pretty much complete. For the rest of the system, however, we have an important project that's going to get started in 2022 that was previously scheduled for 2023. And this is not something that TTI really was aware of when they made their recommendation. And so this project, called the Mall-to-Mall project, this is part of Loop 340 between Interstate 35 and Waco Drive, basically connecting the two malls in our region. That's going to be a big, gnarly project that's going to have a lot of impact to that facility. And so because it's going to be starting a year earlier, we think it's going to have much more of an impact on those percentages for the other freeway category. And so we are recommending a slightly lower standard. And so the recommendations that can be considered by the policy board, they could consider keeping the targets we had from 2018. They could adopt the combination of recommendations from TTI and MPO staff, or they can consider something completely different. All right. So right now we are in the middle of a comment period, and we are accepting comments through February 10th. The technical committee did meet last Thursday to give their recommendation. And then if you missed the opportunity to give us a comment before February 10th, you still have one opportunity through a formal public hearing in front of the MPO Policy Board on February 17th. We just ask that you register at least by 10 a.m. that day so that we can get you as a speaker for that meeting. So if we go to the next slide. Right now we don't have anyone that's joined us this evening, but if you do have questions or comments, please reach out to us by any of the methods that are on this slide here. And we are not particular about how you get in contact with us. Any method is considered acceptable. And also any language. We have the ability to translate any comment that comes our way. And then if you also want to use a comment card as a methodology, you can go to our MPO website and be able to download that at your convenience. So we want to thank you for listening to this information session. We hope that it gave you some good information and at least gave you some knowledge about some pending actions in front of the policy board and whether these are actions that you feel are a good direction for our region. We want to thank you this evening. Hope you have a great evening, great week, and we will be seeing you hopefully for our policy board meeting on the 17th.